You may think you understand the Israel-Palestine conflict. You may think you know enough to make moral pronouncements on social media. But you do not understand the conflict if you do not understand this. The reason the conflict is almost impossible to solve peacefully is because of supremacism. Literally everything flows from that. And if you think the Jews are the supremacists in this equation, then you have it completely backwards. I'll make an analogy from American history by posing a question. In the Jim Crow era, why did Southern whites hate blacks more than they hated the Northerners who actually defeated them in the Civil War? For the same reason that Arabs and Muslims hated Jews much more than they hated the European powers who actually colonized them. Southern whites, during slavery and after, had developed a sense of entitlement to treat blacks as inferior to them. They reacted with a particularly intense rage and hatred when black slaves were freed, thwarting their sense of entitlement. Southern whites reacted that way because that's how supremacists think. That's how oppressors think. Similarly, Arabs and other Muslims had subjugated Jews as dhimmis, second-class citizens, for 1,400 years prior to the reestablishment of Israel. Arabs and other Muslims had developed a sense of entitlement to subject the lowly Jews to oppression that was in many ways worse than Jim Crow or apartheid. When Israel won independence, the Arabs' attitude towards Jews shifted from contempt to an intense hate and rage. They viewed it as a humiliation that the Jews, who were supposed to be below them, would control even a tiny sliver of the Middle East. They viewed the entire region as theirs and theirs alone because they had taken it by force, erasing or subjugating countless indigenous peoples along the way. The humiliation Arabs felt when Israel won independence was similar to the humiliation felt by Southern whites after the Civil War, when freed slaves actually represented Southern states in the U.S. Senate. When Israel defeated 7 Arab armies in its War of Independence, Arabs unleashed collective punishment by ethnically cleansing their ancient Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Jews chased out of the Arab world sought refuge in Israel, where today their children and grandchildren are the majority of Israeli Jews. These are the quote-unquote white settler colonialists that ignorant anti-Semites keep telling you about. The Palestinian movement, which wants to chase Jews out of Israel, is part of the same supremacist ideology that chased these Jews to Israel in the first place. They tell Israeli Jews to go back to where you came from. But do they really expect the grandchildren of Jews who were chased out of Iraq or Syria or Egypt to quote-unquote go back to places they've never lived, to the most racist, anti-Semitic societies in the world? There is a reason that the Middle East is the worst place in the world to be a minority. Ask the Yazidis, Kurds, Assyrians, Maronites, Copts, Amazigh, and certainly ask the Jews about the astronomical levels of racism and supremacism they've endured in the Middle East. It is the only region on earth where blacks are still owned as slaves. In fact, their word for blacks is abid, which means slave. What does this have to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict today? Generations of Palestinians have been indoctrinated to hate Jews and strive to kill them.
بيعلموكم عن حق العودة بالمدارس.
عادش ما احنا مشروع شهادة كلنا. واحنا لازم ندافع عن وطننا كتير. راح ناخذ حقنا والله ينتقم منهم ان شاء الله يموتوا كلهم. القدس عاصمة فلسطين وراح تضلها لنا مش راح تتغير راح تضلها لنا. المستوطنين اللي فيها كلهم راح ينطخوا.
They are actually taught that Jews are subhuman, the descendants of apes and pigs. Their hatred is as intense as the hatred the KKK had for blacks and every bit as racist. They have been indoctrinated to believe a false history of the conflict that casts Jews as evil colonialists and Palestinians as blameless victims with no agency. A lot of gullible Westerners believe it too. That's the subject of another video. But the false history fuels real hatred. And that real hatred is what makes this conflict almost impossible to solve peacefully. All of the security measures that Israel gets criticized for, like checkpoints and walls, are necessary to protect the Jews from people who have been indoctrinated to kill them and keep trying to kill them. The Palestinian movement doesn't want to live side by side with Israel. They want to replace Israel. In English, they chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." But in Arabic, they don't say Palestine will be free. They say Palestine will be Arab. They want the Jews genocided, ethnically cleansed, or at best, living as a subjugated minority under Arab rule, just the way they had it for 1,400 years. The land from the river to the sea, Israel, Gaza, what they call the West Bank, is a tiny sliver of the Middle East. Is it large enough to be shared by two peoples? Perhaps just barely, but not if one side is determined to exterminate the other. Palestinians view a two-state solution as a temporary step on the way to driving the Jews out. That's not the fringe, that's the indoctrinated majority. If you know anything about Israel's pre-1967 borders, you know that it would be suicidal for Israel to allow a hostile power on those borders. Israel would be just 9 miles wide, with Palestinians controlling the strategic highlands overlooking most of Israel's population. They'd be able to turn the so-called West Bank into a much larger, deadlier version of what Gaza became under Hamas. A two-state solution cannot work as long as the genocidal supremacism that has been indoctrinated into the Palestinian population is somehow indoctrinated out of them. Anyone who supports a two-state solution must come up with a viable plan of de-radicalization and de-supremacism. That could take years, if not generations. But in the meantime, it would not be just to create the world's 23rd Arab state and 51st Muslim state at the expense of the world's only Jewish state, especially given how Jews have been treated in those states.